My son's wife said, "You're not on the 68-meter deed." At closing, the realtor looked straight at me and said, "Ready to sign?" Before we begin, hit subscribe and drop a comment with your city and country. Stories travel better when I know where your hearts are listening from. My name is Margaret Harper. I am 74 years old, and my house breathes with the old rhythms of Savannah. Slow ceiling fans, cicadas at dusk, the marsh wind moving through lace curtains, like a memory that refuses to sit still. I was born 15 miles from the water and raised under live oaks gone wild with Spanish moss, and if there's one thing I learned from that coast, it's how to bend without breaking. Quiet isn't weakness. It's patience with teeth. My life has been made of ordinary work. Hands in soil, hands in suds, hands in prayer. I kept books for a bait shop in my 20s, registered patients for a clinic in my 30s, and in my 40s, ran housekeeping for a hotel where tourists came to pretend the city had been built for their photographs. I married a man named John who smelled like cedar and tobacco and always came home with the story meant only for my ears. He died 12 years ago. Peacefully, that's what they say, as if a heart can simply stop and leave no racket in its wake. After that, the house grew a kind of echo. I learned to live alongside it. My son and his wife learned to live above me. At first, it was nimble little things, smiles with a pinch to them, jokes with a hook hidden under the bait. They introduced me to guests as our housekeeper, followed by a laugh that said, "Kidding," but not really. They carried in a set of white dishes thin as paper and called my heavy stoneware quaint. I brought in a table I had saved for, a slab of honest oak with legs the size of hope, and they called it too rustic for the aesthetic. My daughter-in-law had a designer whose name sounded like a perfume, and everything had to go through him, even the curtains I hemmed myself. Vegetables from my garden, okra slick as wet emeralds, tomatoes that bled when you cut them, found their way to the trash under wadded paper towels. The dog ate better. The new stainless fridge shone like a scold and hummed like a threat. When I opened it, there were labels. Her lunch, weekly meal prep, do not touch, as if my hands were thieves and the food was evidence. It's the strangest thing to be a guest in a home where you've paid the taxes for 20 years, but money is only one kind of ownership. Power is another, and my son's wife understood power the way I understand soil. She knew where to push and how to starve what she didn't plant. They liked to stage the house, not just for company. Life itself became an open house, every surface curated for a person I did not know. Coasters like little commandments. Throw pillows with ironic words. Gather, blessed. Like they were trying to convince themselves of something the room didn't believe. I started spending more time outside where the chickens clucked their soft gossip and the lemon balm grew wild by the steps. In the garden, I could breathe. Dirt doesn't ask for permission. Then I got sick, not dying, just a bad spell. The kind that folds a body in half and reminds it of its age. The hospital bed had rails like polite prison bars. When they wheeled me out 2 days later, I imagined sleeping in my own bed, sheets washed and line-dried the way I like, sunlight still trapped in the cotton. Instead, I found my room staged for strangers, fresh paint, new duvet, a glass carafe by the bed filled with water and lemons posing as hospitality. "We're renting it out while you get back on your feet," my daughter-in-law said brightly. "It's such a waste to leave it empty. Income is a strategy." They led me to the basement, cold, concrete, with a cot that had thoughts about giving up. A lamp with a weak bulb huddled on a crate. It smelled of damp cardboard and old paint, the kind of smell that says, "You are here temporarily and we prefer it that way." "It's only for a while," my son said, eyes skittering away from mine. "Just until you're stronger. You don't need to climb stairs." What I needed, it seemed, was to become smaller, quieter, cheaper. My wedding ring sat in a velvet box on the dresser upstairs. It belonged to my grandmother before me, worn thin in places by the weight of 3 marriages and a war. One evening, I came up to fetch it for church and found the box open, the ring gone. My daughter-in-law stood by the window with the kind of smile that makes you want to count your teeth. "We could sell it," she said. "Put the money into the market. Your ring could actually work for you. Stocks, not rocks." I looked at her and saw a woman who believed value only existed where it could be boasted about. Some people confuse shine with worth. Some think paper is more real than metal because you can stack it. I told her I'd think about it. I did not tell her that I knew exactly where she'd hidden the ring, because hiding places tell on their owners. She had tucked it behind the black and gold coffee canister labeled luxury roast, as if she couldn't resist a metaphor. By then, my son and his wife had taken to speaking about me in the third person while I was in the room. "She gets confused," she'd say, and he'd nod, relieved to have a script. "She's sentimental," he'd add, as if that were a diagnosis instead of a mercy. They used words like asset and leverage and exit, and I started hearing my name moving around the house like a piece on a board game, passed from one strategy to another, never trusted to move herself. When John died, he left a house and a truck and a freezer full of fish we never got around to eating, because grief turns ordinary chores into myth. He also left a habit of stashing things, letters, receipts, love notes, corralled with a rubber band, the occasional 50 folded into a book like a pressed leaf. It was a Tuesday with rain on its breath when I found the envelope. It was in the attic, under a false bottom he'd built into an old cedar chest. I knew the chest better than I knew my own knees, but I had never felt that thin seam under my fingertips, the way a magician never reveals the thread until the trick is ready to be told. Inside, a copy of a policy I'd forgotten he ever mentioned, one he'd bought with cash he never bragged about. Not much by the world's loudest standards, but more than enough to turn a tide. There was a note in his clumsy block letters. "If they ever make you feel small, Maggie, stand tall on this." The policy hadn't been listed with our regular papers. It was separate, tucked with an address I recognized from a girlhood I hadn't claimed in decades. Ruth Ellison. We grew up on the same road, learned the same hymns, skipped the same rocks. Ruth had gone north and done numbers the way I do tomatoes. Patient, precise, with a knack for knowing when something is ready. I hadn't called her in years. Grief makes you forget who your hands used to reach for. I called her. Her voice leapt across the distance with that old crackle, busy, brisk, softened for me. "Maggie, you take your time and then you tell me everything." I did. About the staged house in the basement, about the ring and the trash can tomatoes, about the labels in the fridge and the children of strangers sleeping in my room, leaving reviews about the quaint sunlight and the authentic Southern charm. I told her about the policy and how I could feel a hinge somewhere loosening. "Come up," she said, 2 days. "We'll talk where no one can hear your windows." She met me at the Savannah station with a hug that told me I hadn't misremembered a single thing about the girl who used to share my grape soda. Her office smelled like paper and lemon oil and the kind of money that doesn't brag. She read the policy like a prayer and looked up at me with the expression doctors give when they know a patient is going to live. We'll use this to build something that stands between you and their appetite, she said, quietly. No speeches. Let them keep underestimating you, Meg. That's the thing about silence. It can be surrender, yes, but it can also be a ledger. I began to keep one. My son and his wife had been chasing a house, a monster of a place they called a forever home, with a pool that looked like a hotel and stone lions that looked like the kind of joke rich people tell. It wasn't finished yet. It was being built on land that used to grow beans and now was meant to grow envy. The price tag, $68 million for the estate and the acreage that came with it like a rumor. They had leveraged everything to look like the kind of people who don't have to. Their eyes had gone shiny with want. 2 things happened at once that autumn. The first, my daughter-in-law started leaving brochures out on the counter the way you leave bait. The second, a soft-spoken project director gave an interview in a glossy magazine about the development company behind the dream. The company name wasn't new to Ruth. And the land? Well, addresses carry memories, and paper trails love a good reunion. We drew a map. We made calls nobody would trace back to me because the calls didn't come from me. We formed a trust in another state where the pine smell is different and the clerks mind their business. We let the trust do what trusts do best, hold steady while people show their hands. If this sounds like I became someone else overnight, I didn't. I became more of who I had always been. A woman who knows the difference between shouting and speaking at the right time. If you only knew what papers slid under my kitchen door at dawn and whose names glittered on the contracts Ruth laid out on her desk like a deck of very expensive cards. If you knew which signatures would be needed to build a future on stolen ground, and whose signature would turn a feast into ashes. But that is tomorrow's storm. Because on the morning of the closing, the morning they asked me to come along for moral support, I woke before the sun, washed my hands, put on my Sunday suit, and slipped my wedding ring back where it belonged. The chickens muttered in their straw like old women whispering the end of a story. I set the kettle on the stove and watched the steam curl into the light. I thought about John's block letters. Stand tall on this. And I realized I'd been waiting my whole life to speak in a language my son and his wife would finally understand. Consequences. Tell me, have you ever watched a room full of people read a new set of rules they didn't write? Stay with me. You are going to like what happens when the pen refuses to move. Ruth's office sat above a bakery that made the whole block smell like butter and memory. From the front window you could see Broughton Street wag its tail at the tourists. But inside it was just paper and focus and a brass lamp with a pull chain that clicked like a metronome for clear thinking. Ruth wore her reading glasses low, the way she did in 10th grade when she pretended not to see boys showing off. Some habits keep us honest. We're not going to shout, she said, sliding a legal pad toward me. We're going to sign. Quiet is stronger on paper. What do you need from me? I asked. Names, she said, and a little patience. We made a list. My son, my daughter-in-law, the development company, the Shell LLC behind the dirt they were trying to call destiny. Ruth circled 2 items and drew a bridge between them. The land, she said softly, tapping one circle, and the builder, tapping the other. If you can stand in both places at once, you don't need to raise your voice. How do I get to both banks? I said. She smiled. You let me worry about the architecture. 2 weeks later, there was a trust with a name that made me grin when I read it out loud. Live Oak. Not Harper. Not anything that would make a nosy nephew perk up. Live Oak Trust, sound as the tree and twice as hard to chop down. The trust bought what Ruth called a meaningful minority stake in the company building the $68 million dream my daughter-in-law had been cooing over like it was a newborn. 40%, which is not the loudest voice in the room, but is certainly the voice that stops the music when it says no. It also bought the land through another name that sounded like it belonged to a hunting club and not to me. There was a clause, a slender sentence with a spine of steel, stating that any transfer of that land required the written consent of all beneficial owners of the trust. Ruth circled that line and said, "This is your hand on the brake." "And if they try to get cute?" I asked. "Then the other clause bites," Ruth said, tapping the second paragraph. "Kill switch," she called it. If the co-owner did not sign, the deal died and the deposit was forfeited. "They brought greed to the table," Ruth said. "We'll bring gravity." "And Marcus?" I asked, my throat unexpectedly tight on his name. Ruth's eyes softened. "You and I are working to protect you. Him. Only his choices can protect him now." She paused. "But we can also be the lender of last resort." I blinked. "We're going to loan them the down payment?" "Not we," Ruth said, precise. "A third-party lender whose capital happens to include Live Oak funds. That's the mask. They'll be grateful for the help. They think they outsmarted the bank into giving them. And they'll sign the standard terms without reading the fine print because people reaching for what they want rarely read." "What's the fine print?" "That their lender can call the loan if material control of the land changes," Ruth said, eyes twinkling. "Which it will, the second you don't sign." I sat very still. I could hear the bakery downstairs pulling trays from the oven, that soft metal hush. Somewhere in the hall a copy machine exhaled. Funny how the world keeps doing its ordinary chores while your life hatches a plan in front of you. "Ruth," I said, "what if I can't do it? What if, when it's time, I fold?" She reached across the desk and put her hand on mine, the same hand that held my hair back when we were 15 and I cut it badly in a mirror. "Maggie, you already did the hardest part. You learned to wait. Now you just have to stay true." I stayed quiet in that house after we set the pieces. I cooked when the kitchen was empty and ate outside when it wasn't. I gathered eggs while my daughter-in-law hosted something she called a vision board brunch, where women drank champagne and glued pictures of yachts to poster boards. I went down to my basement room at night and listened to the pipes make the same noises they made when John and I were first married, when Marcus was a baby with a cough and a future no one had yet scratched. My son started bringing me articles in a tone that tried for helpful and landed on condescending. "Mama, look at this. Power of attorney can save families so much time." He nudge-printed pages toward me as if we were equals at a desk and not a child, and his mother at a table I paid for with years in a ledger that didn't record money. "It's just easier," he said. "For whom?" I asked. "For everyone," he said too quickly. My daughter-in-law added sugar with a smile. "Margaret, you could nap more, garden more, leave the boring adult stuff to us. We do real estate." She said real estate like it was a kingdom and not a mess men make with paper and patience. She held up a pen with gold flecks in it. "You just need to sign a few things." "Bring them by," I said. "I like to read in the quiet." She frowned. "People who rely on rush don't like when you ask for time." "Sure, of course." That night, alone in the basement, I opened a small velvet pouch and took out a tiny recorder my neighbor's nephew had recommended when my coupe door latch kept getting moved by human hands pretending to be raccoons. Georgia is a one-party consent state. Ruth had said it plain and cool, and I've been talking in my own home since the 70s. I set the recorder on the milk crate beside the weak-kneed lamp. I pressed the red dot and said the date in a voice that surprised me with its steadiness. The next day, my daughter-in-law came with a stack of documents crisp enough to cut bread. She wore a blazer the color of new money and perfume the smell of a department store bridal registry. "Margaret, your signature here would allow us to act in your best interest," she said, tapping a line marked Durable Power of Attorney. "And this one just streamlines closing. You don't even have to be there." She flipped pages with theatrical speed. "You can trust us." "Trust is the currency of the poor," I said gently, "and I used it up long ago." I picked up the first page, scanned it, set it down. "Let's practice. Use your best voice and explain these to me like I'm not stupid." Her smile thinned. "It's all standard." "Explain it," I repeated. She exhaled a laugh. "Fine, you're old, Margaret. We are modern. This makes everything smoother, and when the house closes," she flashed me a look like a blade, "we'll have a better space for you." "In a basement?" I asked. "In a facility," she said, still smiling, "if that's what's best." The recorder glowed its little red certainty. I could almost hear Ruth's pencil scratching a note in a margin a city away. That evening, my son sat at the end of my cot like a boy at camp trying to make peace with a bunkmate. He strung words together like lights on a too-short strand, leaving gaps of dark between them. "Mama, we're close. The builder gave us a great window and our lender, miracle worker." He squeezed my hand. "We could be in by Christmas." "You really want that house?" I asked. He looked past me, the way men do when they've married a picture they can no longer see the frame around. "It's a forever home." "Forever," I repeated, letting the word ring against the concrete walls like a joke God tells when men start making plans. All right, you'll sign?" he asked, hope washing his face clean. It nearly broke me. "I'll come to closing," I said. "I'll sign what's mine to sign." He hugged me, clumsy like he was 15 again. For a second, I smelled the boy who used to fall asleep on my arm during thunderstorms, long before he learned to call his mother an obstacle more politely. Closing day came like thunder wrapped in silk. The conference room was all glass and brushed steel and a view of people who had someplace better to be. The long table was dressed the way my daughter-in-law likes to dress rooms, nothing useful, everything glossy. Bottled water lined up like skinny soldiers, pens in a cup like flowers that never die. She arrived in a white blazer and a mouthful of whispers. "Smile," she breathed, teeth barely moving. "Don't embarrass us." "Good morning," I said to the room. My voice sounded like it had found its boots. My son looked pale. He patted his breast pocket as if the right words might be hiding there on a folded cue card. The broker asked if we were ready. The notary tapped a neat stack into alignment, lips pursed with the joy of a tidy job. The file folders wore tabs like parade ribbons. Warranty deed, power of attorney, closing disclosure, easements. Easements, I thought. Such a pretty word for permission. They slid the papers across to me with the choreography of people who've done this too many times to remember the first time they believed it was sacred. My daughter-in-law leaned in, her voice a sugar knife. "Sign now, Margaret, or I promise you this. When we walk out of here, I'll make sure you never see the inside of this beautiful home unless it's through the window of a shuttle bus from the nursing facility. Do you understand me?" The recorder in my purse warmed like a small animal, its red dot invisible under the leather. I kept my face mild, the way you look at a child throwing sand. Not because you are afraid, but because you know the tide is coming. "You threatened me. I said quietly. She laughed, theatrical for the benefit of the room. She's confused. She gets dramatic. The notary coughed. The broker looked at his watch. My son said my name, soft like a man pleading with a door. Mama, please. I picked up the pen, uncapped it, and wrote my name where it belonged, on the sign-in sheet. Then I put the pen down and folded my hands in my lap. I looked at my son first, because he was once the only person in any room I needed to see. I told you I'd sign what's mine, but I don't sign away what isn't. What does that even mean? My daughter-in-law hissed. It means, I said, turning my head as the conference room door opened, you're about to find out who this land belongs to. The project director stepped in, calm as a Sunday usher, with a woman in a navy suit at his shoulder whose eyes told me she had balanced books more complicated than this table. He set a folder on the table and spoke in a voice that made even the pens listen. Before we proceed, he said, there are 2 disclosures everyone at this table needs to hear. Stay with me. What came next didn't make a sound at first. It only took the sound away from everyone else. The project director set a folder on the glass and spoke like a man who had practiced the sentence in front of a mirror until it could not wobble. Disclosure number 1, he said. The land under contract for the Harper Gaines residence is held by a trust-owned entity. Any transfer requires the written consent of all beneficial owners. My daughter-in-law's smile faltered, then clicked back in place, newscaster bright. And, she asked, looking past me as if the point might be hiding behind the notary. The woman beside him, navy suit, smart eyes, a lawyer who has crawled through more clauses than most people crawl through years, placed a single sheet on the table and turned it so the names faced us. The trust name read like shade and history, Live Oak. Beneath it, a tidy list of its beneficial owners, just one line for the world to trip over. Consent, the attorney said, tapping the line where my name lived, means this signature. Silence moved across the room like a cloud. My son's hand went to his pocket again, but this time he wasn't reaching for words. He was feeling for a ground that had just shifted. I didn't reach for the pen. I reached for the memory of how that signature had gotten there in the first place, how the roots of this live oak had been planted months before anyone in this room thought to look up. Ruth had said it first, in her office above the butter-smelling bakery. Don't build a fortress, build a switch. You mean a kill switch, I'd answered, rolling the phrase around like a marble. It sounded dangerous and necessary, the kind of thing a quiet woman keeps in her pocket for the day the volume gets turned up on her life. She showed me the architecture with a patience that felt like love. We formed Live Oak, in a state with clerks who keep their mouths closed and paperwork that doesn't gossip. Live Oak, in turn, formed a small LLC that bought the dirt. Nothing dramatic, no fireworks, just a deed transferred on a Tuesday when the sky was ordinary and the courthouse smelled like floor wax. In a separate lane, Live Oak bought 40% of the development company, the one my daughter-in-law bragged about on the terrace like it was a handbag. You won't be the loudest voice, Ruth said, but if you say no at the right moment, the music stops. We didn't shout. We signed. We signed at unimportant times of day in plain rooms where no one takes selfies. We signed with pens that had bitten through grocery lists and birthday cards. We signed in tiny print that men like to wave past. And because greed likes leverage, we gave them some. My son and his wife didn't have the cash for the down payment. Most people don't. They had the posture of money, the car, the watch, the vocabulary, but they were trying to buy a forever with coupons. A lender appeared when their usual bank nibbled and then backed away. a private lender with a bland name and a term sheet full of small teeth. Its capital came from a braided river of funds, one branch, quietly and legally, from Live Oak. Ruth called it placing the fulcrum. The loan had a clause about material change of control in the underlying land. If the land says no, the loan says pay me now, she told me, circling it with her pencil. And if they cannot, the deposit goes to the place the clause tells it to go. Where does it tell it to go? I'd asked. Ruth's smile tilted. Where you tell me it should. After we inked it all, she made me do something I didn't expect. Walk me through the day you flinch, she said, no softness in it. I frowned. I don't plan to flinch. No one plans to, she said. Talk me through it anyway. So we rehearsed it like church ladies practice the harmony in a hymn. If my son begged, if my daughter-in-law threatened, if they brought a priest, if they brought a doctor, if they went quiet and let guilt try to do what their mouths could not. Every time the answer was the same. You sign what's yours, you do not sign what isn't. When I wavered, Ruth would put a hand on my forearm the way she used to when we were girls about to cross a road. Maggie, she'd say, you survived their basement. You can survive their faces. Back in the conference room, faces were doing their work. My daughter-in-law laughed. A little too hard for that small A room. This is ridiculous, she said. She's confused. We already have her power of attorney. The notary, to her credit, raised an eyebrow in a way that asked, do you? The project director's smile didn't change, but an entire paragraph of amusement wrote itself behind his eyes. The attorney slid a second document forward, a thing with tabs like tiny flags. Disclosure number 2, she said. There is no executed durable power of attorney on file with any party to this transaction. There is, however, this. She flipped to a page where a paragraph narrowed like a funnel. Any transfer, encumbrance, or development on the parcel known as Tract B requires unanimous consent of the beneficial owners of Live Oak. She paused. That's Mrs. Harper. My son's voice came up small. Mama, we can fix this. Just sign. Don't ruin this for us. I wanted to say, son, when you rented my room to strangers, you were not fixing anything. When you carried my ring toward the market like a stock with a ticker symbol, you were not building us a future. You were testing the limits of a woman who had not yet shown you she had any. But I didn't say that. I looked at him and remembered the weight of him as a baby asleep against my chest during a summer storm, sweat beading his hairline like pearls. I turned to the lawyer. Would you mind reading the consent clause again? I asked, smiling. Sometimes my ears like to hear a pretty line twice. She did. I nodded, as if I just heard good music. What no one at the table knew was that there was a third paper waiting in my purse, beneath the little recorder, whose red dot had quietly harvested the threats my daughter-in-law made when no one was grading her on her manners. The third paper carried a name that mattered only to the people it would shelter, Haven House Foundation. Ruth and I had drafted it on a gray morning, steam rising from her tea while the rain traced the old brick outside. The deed sat ready, not to transfer ownership to me, but to pass land and structure to Haven House, the moment the kill switch tripped and the deposit landed where the clause pointed. I had asked Ruth for one additional flourish, a donor plaque. Small, I told her, tasteful, with 2 names as honorary sponsors. She knew which names, but that flourish could wait. What mattered now was the switch. Mrs. Harper, the project director, said carefully, we are prepared to proceed if you are. I uncapped the pen. My daughter-in-law sat forward, eyes pinned to my hand like a hawk watching a mouse. I signed the sign-in sheet again just to make the notary smile and capped the pen. "I do not consent," I said softly, like a woman ordering coffee the way she likes it, unsurprised to hear herself get it right. There is a particular kind of quiet that rooms full of confident people fall into when they realize they have mistaken the lamb for the shepherd. This was that quiet. The broker coughed into his hand. The notary realigned the pens because some people need to tidy when their world tilts. My son's chair scraped. "Mama, we'll lose the deposit." I met his eyes. "Then perhaps next time you'll read the fine print you ask other people to sign." The attorney nodded to the project director, and a string of small civilized events occurred. A call to the escrow officer, a confirmation code, a notation in a ledger that would outlast the suits in this room. Somewhere in a server farm humming in air-conditioned indifference, numbers moved from a line labeled Buyers to one labeled Haven House. I let the room breathe a minute and then reached into my purse, not for the recorder, not yet, but for an envelope with Haven House letterhead and 2 embossed cards inside. "Since we're all here," I said, setting them on the glass as gently as you place a newborn in its crib, "there's one more signature to witness later today, a donation. The estate and tract will be conveyed to Haven House Foundation, effective upon release of funds." My daughter-in-law stared at the cards like they were written in a language she refused to learn. "A donation?" she repeated. "To who?" "To the women who will sleep safe on that land," I said. "Women like me who outlive their usefulness in someone else's story, but not in their own." The project director smiled then, the first real smile I'd seen from him. He knew the shape of consequences. "And these?" the attorney asked, picking up the embossed cards. "Plaques for the entry," I said. "Honorary sponsors. Their names will be there a long time." I didn't look at my son when I said it. I looked at the woman who had threatened me with a facility and called it mercy. Her face did something I have only seen twice. The day she realized I would not sign away my name, and the day she realized love could be spelled with a T and an R and a U and a ST that did not include her. The broker swallowed. The notary clicked her stamp, then stopped, unsure what ceremony applied to a room that had just changed the weather. This would have been a good place to end things politely, to collect our coats and leave with the same quiet we arrived in. But I had one more line to speak, and it was not for this table. It was for the people who would hear it soon enough when a local journalist pressed play and let the county listen. Georgia is a one-party consent state. It only takes one person in the room to say, "This happened," and make it so. I closed my purse over the recorder's warm little heartbeat and stood. "I'll send you my non-consent in writing for the file," I told the attorney, "and this afternoon I'll be making a different filing." My son stood, color gone from his face. "Mama, please." "Son," I said, and my voice was steel-wrapped in silk, "this is me protecting my home the way you should have protected me." We left the room one at a time, attorney, director, broker, notary, my daughter-in-law, with her silence finally working for once in her life. My son lingered, as boys will when they don't know the right door anymore. On the sidewalk, the heat rose off the concrete like a prayer no one believes in. I could smell the river even from here, iron and tide. Ruth was waiting in her car across the street, engine off, window down. She didn't wave. She just lifted her chin like a lighthouse keeper counting the beam rotations until the ship clears the rocks. "Ready?" she asked when I opened the passenger door. "For what?" I said. "For the part where quiet stops being a strategy," she said, "and starts being a headline." "You think the room froze today? Wait until you hear what the county did when the recording went live." By the time summer began to melt into August, my plan was no longer a sketch on paper. It was an engine humming quietly in the shadows, every gear oiled, every bolt tightened. Ruth and I had moved with precision. The trust was airtight, its name innocuous enough to never raise suspicion. Coastal Horizon Partners. A title bland enough to bore, deliberate enough to shield. On the surface, it looked like a small private investment group. Underneath, it was the key to my freedom. I kept my movements subtle. No large withdrawals, no sudden purchases. I wanted Marcus and Tiffany to keep believing I was the aging mother who shuffled from kitchen to porch, pruning roses and reading paperbacks. My real work happened in the hours they thought I was napping. Phone calls with Ruth, document drafts reviewed line by line, late-night emails that mapped their downfall. One humid afternoon, Ruth called with a tone in her voice I hadn't heard since we were girls, conspiring to sneak into the county fair after hours. "It's done," she said. "The land parcel deed is in your name, transferred through the trust. That means when they borrow from us, they're essentially borrowing from you. And the repayment terms, let's just say they won't survive a default." I felt my chest tighten. Not from fear, but from the satisfaction of knowing I held the one card they didn't even know existed. The next step came faster than I expected. Marcus showed up one evening, wearing that forced grin he used whenever he wanted something. Tiffany trailed behind, tapping on her phone, barely looking at me. "Mama," Marcus began, "we've found the perfect property. 48 acres, custom design, gated, minutes from the golf course. It's a once-in-a-lifetime deal." Tiffany looked up from her screen, her eyes sharp. "It's going to be worth triple in 5 years, but we're just a little short on the down payment. Ruth's group is willing to lend. We just need your blessing. You'll get a nice return, too." I kept my voice flat. "And what do you get?" Her lips curled. "Everything we've worked for." It took effort not to smile. I agreed, pretending to be the trusting old woman they imagined me to be. "If Ruth thinks it's wise, then I'll sign." In reality, Ruth had already set the trap. The lending contract included a kill clause, one signature missing from me at closing, and the entire deal would collapse. Not only would they lose the property, but they'd forfeit their entire deposit to the trust. The weeks leading up to the closing were a test of my patience. Tiffany became bolder in her cruelty, perhaps emboldened by the thought of her dream estate. She accidentally donated some of my late husband's jackets to a thrift shop. She tossed jars of homemade peach preserves, peaches from my own trees, into the trash, muttering something about unlabeled food being unsafe. Marcus wasn't much better. He'd begun talking to me in the sing-song tone people reserve for toddlers and the elderly they think are losing their grip. "You sure you understand what's going on with the sale, Mama? It's complicated stuff." I would nod, smile faintly, and excuse myself to water the garden. Inside, I repeated the same silent vow. "You'll understand soon enough, son." The night before closing, I stood at my kitchen sink staring out at the moonlit garden. The hydrangeas were heavy with blooms, their petals pale against the darkness. My late husband's voice seemed to echo in my memory. "Don't let them take what you've built, Maggie." By morning, my resolve was steel. I wore my best navy suit, the one I'd kept for church weddings and the occasional town meeting. My hair was set, my lipstick precise. If they wanted to see the crazy old woman they described to friends, they were in for disappointment. When I arrived at the law office, Marcus and Tiffany were already there, their energy electric. Tiffany's laughter was sharp, bouncing off the mahogany-paneled walls. Marcus waved me over, sliding a thick folder in my direction. "Just a few signatures, Mama," he said too casually. I flipped open the folder and saw it immediately. Not just the property documents, but 2 additional pages granting them permanent power of attorney and full rights to any property I owned. My jaw tightened, but I didn't let my expression change. Before I could respond, the conference room door opened. 2 men in tailored suits entered. One, I recognized from Ruth's descriptions as the project director, the other, the company's lead attorney. Mrs. Harper, the attorney said, as you know, this sale cannot proceed without your approval as co-owner of the development company and sole title holder of the land. The room stilled. Tiffany's hand froze mid-reach for her pen. Marcus blinked at me, confusion flickering into panic. I leaned back in my chair, meeting each of their eyes in turn. I've decided not to sign. The land stays where it is, in my name. The deposit, I glanced at the attorney who nodded, will be retained by the trust. The sound Tiffany made was somewhere between a gasp and a growl. Marcus's face drained of color. And just so we're all clear, I continued, sliding another folder across the table, this land and any future development on it will be transferred to the Haven House Foundation, a shelter for abandoned elderly women. Your names will appear as honorary sponsors on every plaque, every program, every piece of press material for the rest of your lives. Their mouths opened, but no sound came. It was the first time in years they had nothing to say. I rose from my seat, the click of my heels against the hardwood, loud in the silence, and walked out into the bright Georgia sun. My hands didn't shake. My breath was steady. They had wanted me powerless. Instead, I'd left them with nothing but their own reflection, and the weight of the story that was about to follow them everywhere. The morning after the closing felt like the tide had turned in its sleep. The air over Savannah was bright and too honest for lies, the kind of light that makes dust confess. I brewed coffee, fed the hens, and set the little recorder on the kitchen table as if it were a guest I'd been waiting on for years. Ruth arrived at 9 sharp with a folder, a fountain pen, and that look she gets when the math is about to meet the moral. "Ready?" she asked. "Georgia's a one-party state," I said, tapping the recorder, "and I was the party." She smiled without teeth. "Then let's let the truth walk on its own 2 legs." We drove into town with the windows cracked, the marsh smell coming in like a hymn. The journalist Ruth trusted worked out of a narrow office above a barber shop, the kind of old Savannah spot where the linoleum floor has heard 10,000 secrets and keeps everyone. Her name was Lila. Hair up, sleeves rolled, eyes like a human lie detector. She didn't pretend to be impressed by us or by the story. Good reporters know only the facts deserve applause. I handed her the recorder. "You'll want the last 30 minutes, I said. "Start with the word facility." Lila listened on headphones, her face a measured weather report. She rewound twice. She took notes with a pencil that had no eraser, as if she had no intention of taking anything back. "You understand we'll need counsel to clear this?" she said at last. "I understand," I said. "I brought mine." I tilted my head toward Ruth, who had already produced copies of the statutes, highlighted like a Sunday school lesson. Lila skimmed, nodded, and made 2 calls, one to her editor, one to the paper's lawyer. 48 hours, she said, then reconsidered. "No, 24. I went home and watered the basil that noon with a steadier hand than I'd had in months. The hens followed me like old friends who don't need an invitation. I put on a record, Etta James, and let the house learn a new kind of quiet, the kind that comes before a bell rings. The story hit at 5:12 p.m. the next day. It wasn't a shout. It was a clear, careful headline on the Savannah Beacon site, local woman records, daughter-in-law threatening nursing home to secure property transfer. Below, a subhead that didn't editorialize, Georgia is a one-party consent state. And then the audio. My daughter-in-law's voice, sugar-iced and venom-laced. Sign now, Margaret, or I promise you this. When we walk out of here, I'll make sure you never see the inside of this beautiful home, unless it's through the window of a shuttle bus from the nursing facility. The comments started as murmurs and became a choir. Neighbors who had attended her vision board brunches typed long confessions about the unease they'd ignored. A deacon's wife from their church posted a single sentence. We take care of our elders here, and it gathered 1,000 hearts. The HOA president, who loves the word bylaws more than scripture, announced that her seat on the Architectural Review Committee was under evaluation. A radio show lifted the audio and played it between weather and traffic. A morning anchor winced on live TV when the clip rolled. By sundown, the country club issued a statement, membership privileges suspended pending review. The boutique realtor, who'd been so proud to show them off on billboards, emailed to remove their photos from success stories. Tiffany's friends untagged themselves on social media like people stepping away from a slow-moving fire. I didn't gloat. I clipped deadheads from the roses and stirred a pot of soup. Consequences are not confetti. They are gravity doing its work. The second wave hit 3 days later when the Beacon published Part 2, Trust Kills 68 Milers Estate Deal, Deposit Redirected to Haven House Foundation. The piece included a photo of the foundation's director shaking hands with the project attorney, and there at the bottom, tasteful bronze, was a rendering of the entry plaque. Honorary sponsors, Margaret Harper and Tiffany Gaines. The internet called it poetic. I called it accurate. Phone calls started then. Some I answered, some I let ring. A woman from the County Commission on Aging invited me to speak at a luncheon. I told her I didn't need a microphone. I needed volunteers for Haven House. By the weekend, 5 women from the garden club were hauling mulch on the new property where the estate would have stood. We planted rosemary along the walk and lavender by the porch so the air would smell like a welcome, not a waiting room. Then came the quieter fallout, the kind that stings longer. At the grocery, I saw Tiffany frozen in front of the rotisserie chickens, reading labels as if they had instructions for time travel. A friend turned her cart away without a word. At church, Marcus tried to slip into a back pew. An usher with kind eyes touched his elbow and said, "Son, the pastor would like a word after service." Their boat disappeared from the marina slip. A tow truck loaded the German car one morning while the neighborhood dogs kept time. Bills have a way of finding their houses when the music stops. Final notices stacked up in the mailbox. I no longer checked for them. The house stager took back her furniture. The designer with the perfume name ghosted. The forever home became a listing with a realtor who specializes in distressed opportunities. Lila called to say national outlets wanted quotes. I said no. I wasn't turning my life into a podcast. She understood. She also told me something I'd been waiting to hear. Haven House broke ground this morning. Thought you'd like to know. I drove out after supper. The sky wore that bruised Georgia purple, and the rented excavator sat like a sleeping dinosaur. I walked the edge of the property and tried to see porches and quilts and coffee steam where halls and chandeliers had been promised. The director met me at the field gate, cheeks raw from wind and smiling. "You changed the outcome for women who haven't even packed their bags yet," she said. "No," I told her. "We changed it." I pressed an envelope into her hand. Seed money for the kitchen garden. Ruth's idea. My joy. Plant herbs by the back steps, I said. People should smell dinner before they see it. Nights were easier then. The basement cot had been replaced by my own bed again. The renter's listing had come down. My ring lived where it belonged. I slept with the window open to let crickets argue with the moon. In the mornings, I made coffee and answered 3 kinds of letters. Women telling me their daughters had moved them to garages. Sons apologizing for not calling enough. One handwritten note from a nurse who said, "Thank you for making what I see every shift harder to hide." Marcus tried a dozen times to reach me those first 2 weeks. I returned 2 calls. Both conversations were short. "Mama," he said on the second one, voice rough from swallowing pride, "I'm sorry. Marcus," I said. "Being sorry is a beginning. It's not a plan." "What do I do?" "Start by returning what isn't yours. Then go down to Haven House and offer your Saturdays. Learn to carry boxes and listen to women who don't owe you sweetness. After that, we'll talk." He said he would. I said we'd see. I hung up and stood a while at the sink, watching a blue heron lift out of the marsh like it knew something about second chances. The town moved on, as towns do, even when they pretend they don't. The county fair set up lights near the ball fields. The grocery stocked early apples. The air shifted from wet wool to clean cotton. I walked the rows of my garden with a basket on my arm, grateful for the honesty of plants. Give them sun and water. They won't repay you with insults. 3 months slipped by, then 6. Somewhere in the middle, I saw a moving truck in front of Marcus and Tiffany's place, and then a for rent sign in the yard. Word was they'd taken a small apartment on the edge of town, one of those beige rectangles you can hear the neighbor sneeze through. The boat was gone, the cars were practical, the dinner photos stopped. A mutual friend told me Tiffany had applied for a job at a furniture showroom and been told they had nothing available at the moment. The moment stretched. When the knock came, the sky was gray with a rain that couldn't commit. My chickens had gone in early. The yard smelled like wet straw and turned earth. I wiped my hands on a towel and walked to the door without hurrying. Some moments deserve a measured pace. Marcus stood on the porch, soaked to the collarbone, eyes ringed with the kind of tired money can't fix. Tiffany stood a half step behind him, bare face, hair pulled back, like a woman who has run out of performances. In his hands, a cardboard box with the spine of a photo album peeking out. In hers, nothing but a look I had never seen before, something quiet, almost human. "Mama," he said, voice small, we don't have anywhere else to go, just for a little while, until we get steady." I let the rain speak for a few beats, the water ticking off the gutter like a clock reminding us all we'd wasted time. I thought of my basement cot. I thought of the facility and the shuttle bus window. I thought of the women whose beds were being built on land my silence had saved. "Come in out of the rain," I said at last, and stepped aside. They crossed the threshold, dripping onto the mat that says "Entry by invitation only." I closed the door behind them and turned, slow as a porch swing. Because what I told them in my kitchen next would be the sentence the neighborhood repeated for a year, and the one Marcus would remember longer than his wedding vows. The fallout didn't happen overnight. It began as a slow leak, one drop of truth at a time, until the dam burst and swept them into the current they'd thought they controlled. 2 days after the closing disaster, I made my way to the small, tidy office of a local journalist I'd trusted for years. Her name was Carla Dean, a woman with a spine of steel and a nose for stories that rattled the polite bones of Savannah society. I'd brought her a flash drive, nothing more, nothing less. "What's on it?" she asked, eyes narrowing the way a hawk narrows its gaze before the dive. "A conversation," I said. "My daughter-in-law," making it clear she planned to put me in a nursing home once she had my signature. Carla knew Georgia law as well as I did. One-party consent meant that the recording I'd captured months earlier, on a day when Tiffany's arrogance outpaced her caution, was perfectly legal to share. Carla leaned back, a slow grin spreading across her face. "You understand this will blow up." "I'm counting on it," I replied. The article dropped 3 days later, paired with a 30-second audio clip that didn't need embellishment. Tiffany's voice, sharp, smug, dripping with condescension, played over and over on local news broadcasts. "Once she signs, I'll have her in a home by Christmas. Old people shouldn't own property." By the end of the week, the whispers had started. Neighbors avoided their eyes at the grocery store. The golf club temporarily suspended their membership, citing unforeseen public relations issues. Marcus's business associates suddenly became too busy to take his calls. I didn't gloat. Not in public. I tended my garden, brought peach pies to the church bake sale, kept my life steady. But every so often I'd catch a glimpse of them around town, their posture a little lower, Tiffany's makeup unable to hide the strain. One humid September morning, I received a letter from the Haven House Foundation. The estate transfer had made headlines in charity circles. Apparently, the size of the donation was the largest they'd ever received. They invited me to a small ceremony to unveil the foundation's new wing, complete with a plaque bearing my name. And just as the clause demanded, Marcus and Tiffany's names were etched there too, forever linked to an act they had tried to twist for themselves. The irony wasn't lost on the community. People would point, whispering, "Aren't those the ones who tried to take her house?" It wasn't just social exile that bit at them, it was financial ruin. The deposit they lost on the estate had been most of their liquid savings. Without the property to leverage, their grand renovation company fell into debt. By December, they'd sold their boat, their second car, and eventually the condo they'd bought as a starter flip project. I heard all of this not from gossip, but from Ruth, who kept tabs with a quiet efficiency that had served her well in finance. She'd call me with updates, her voice dry but amused. "They just listed the condo for $80K below market. Desperate sale." One evening, as I sat on my porch watching the sun bleed orange over the marshes, I realized the war was over. I hadn't shouted, I hadn't slammed doors. I'd simply waited, planned, and struck when the moment was right. And now, the silence around me was mine. Not the silence of being ignored, but the peace of knowing the people who disrespected me no longer had the power to enter my life. Still, there was one thing left. A final act that wasn't about revenge, but about closure. And it would require me to look both of them in the eye one last time. The invitation wasn't on paper. It wasn't even spoken. It was a carefully arranged inevitability. I had Ruth reach out to Marcus under the guise of closing a loose end in the trust paperwork. The bait was simple. A promise of a small payout if he and Tiffany showed up at my home to sign a final release. Money talks, especially when it's the only voice they have left to hear. They arrived on a late January afternoon, the sky low and gray, rain beating on the hood of their aging SUV. I watched from the front window as they hesitated at the gate, reading the brass plaque. Entry by invitation only. The latch clicked, and they walked the narrow brick path toward my porch, every step betraying how far they'd fallen from their high-ground arrogance. Marcus looked thinner, the easy confidence gone from his shoulders. Tiffany was still dressed to impress, heels, tailored coat, but there was a hollowness in her eyes, the kind that comes when the phone stops ringing and the friends disappear. I didn't greet them outside. I let them knock. 3 times. Then I opened the door just enough to let the cool air in and said, "Come in, but wipe your shoes." Inside, the kitchen smelled of cinnamon bread just pulled from the oven, not for them, of course, for me. I motioned to the table where 3 folders lay neatly stacked. They sat, and for a moment, nobody spoke. The ticking of the old clock over the sink filled the space between us. Marcus finally broke the silence. "Mom, I know things got out of hand." His voice cracked on Mom like it had to crawl through broken glass to get out. "Out of hand?" I repeated slowly. "You tried to strip me of my home, my rights, and my dignity. You hired a man to declare me incompetent. That man happened to be your father, though you didn't know it." Tiffany shifted uncomfortably but kept her chin high. "We were thinking about your future. You can't live alone forever." I leaned forward. "No, you were thinking about your future. I was just in the way." The folder stayed closed in front of them. "Inside," I said, "you'll find the release forms you came for, but there's no payout. You'll sign them because it's the last shred of integrity you have left." Marcus's jaw tightened. "And if we don't?" I slid a 4th folder onto the table. This one read, "Then this goes to every remaining client you have, every landlord, every potential investor. It's a compilation of every public record, every debt, every failed project, and that little audio clip you hate so much. I call it the full picture." Tiffany's hand darted for the red folder, but I covered it with mine. "Not yet. Make a choice first." The fight went out of them faster than I expected. Marcus picked up the pen, signed without reading, and slid the papers back. Tiffany followed, her signature small and tight like she wanted to disappear between the letters. I stood, gathering the folders. "You can go now." Marcus looked up, something like hope flickering in his eyes. "Mom, do you hate us?" I considered my answer. "No. Hate's heavy, and I've carried enough. But I don't trust you, and trust once broken isn't something you can buy back with apologies." They left without another word. Through the rain-specked glass, I watched them walk down the path, smaller somehow, until the gate closed behind them with a soft metallic click. When the silence settled again, it was different, final. I'd ended it not with shouting, but with boundaries. And boundaries, I realized, were stronger than any wall I could build. There was still one chapter left in this story, but it wasn't for them. It was for me, and for every woman who'd ever been told she was too old, too weak, or too alone to fight back. The weeks after that rainy afternoon unfolded like the slow turning of a page I'd waited my whole life to read. The air around my home felt lighter, though the winter wind still curled under the eaves. I woke early, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. Coffee brewing, the first light spilling across the worn pine floors. For the first time in years, the quiet in my house was mine, not a silence forced by intimidation or fear. I'd learned that victory isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the absence of footsteps you don't want to hear, the stillness of knowing no one can come through your door uninvited. The brass plaque at my gate caught the morning sun. Entry by invitation only. Every time I passed it, I thought about the irony, how something so small could hold the weight of my entire philosophy. Ruth called one morning, her voice bubbling with something between triumph and mischief. "Margaret," she said, "the Haven House Foundation wants you to attend their spring benefit. They're naming you as their principal benefactor for the year." I hesitated. My giving had always been quiet, deliberate, but then I remembered the look on Tiffany's face when she heard the estate was going to Haven House. The disbelief that her golden prize would be shelter for women she wouldn't even acknowledge in public. I agreed to go. The night of the benefit, I wore a deep navy dress that had hung in my closet for years, save for an occasion that never came, until now. Ruth arrived to pick me up, and we drove to the old city hall, now converted into a ballroom. Inside, the air smelled of fresh flowers and lemon polish. Soft jazz swirled around conversations, laughter, the clinking of glasses. When they called my name, I walked to the podium, the stage lights warming my face. The room quieted. I could see faces turned toward me, some familiar, others strangers, but all waiting. I've been told, I began, that generosity is the act of giving without expecting anything in return. But I'll be honest with you tonight. I did expect something. I expected peace. And I found it, not by holding tighter to what was mine, but by letting go in a way that protected others. I spoke about Haven House, about the women I'd met there, one who'd been locked out of her own home by a nephew, another whose children stopped visiting after she refused to sign over her savings. Their stories were my story, just in different voices. The applause that followed wasn't just polite, it was sustained, warm, like a tide that rose around me without drowning me. In that moment, I realized this chapter of my life wasn't about revenge at all. It was about reclamation, of dignity, of worth, of the right to live without fear in the autumn years of your life. Back home, I stood in my kitchen, the award from Haven House resting on the counter beside a fresh loaf of cinnamon bread. I thought of Marcus and Tiffany, not with anger, but with the kind of detachment you have when you finished a book and placed it back on the shelf. Their chapter was closed, but mine still had pages left, and I intended to fill them with more than defense. I wanted to fill them with purpose. That night, I wrote in my journal, "Silence isn't surrender. It's waiting for the right moment to speak so that your words become action, and your action becomes the story others tell when they need courage." The first warm days of spring arrived quietly in Georgia, without fanfare, like an old friend slipping back into town. My garden stirred awake, azaleas blushing pink, bees humming low in the rosemary, the hens clucking softly as they picked through the grass. Every corner of my little property felt alive, yet grounded, as if it too had exhaled after holding its breath for years. I'd settled into a rhythm that felt like freedom. Morning coffee on the porch, letters from old friends, some I hadn't heard from in decades, who had read about the Haven House gift in the local paper. Even the postman seemed to linger a little longer at my gate, offering stories about his grandmother, about what family should mean. But peace doesn't erase the past. It reframes it. One rainy afternoon, I was at my writing desk, sorting through a stack of bills and seed catalogs, when I saw an envelope with Marcus's handwriting. I let it sit for hours before opening it. Inside was a single sheet, no greeting, no pleasantries. "Mom," it read, "I'm sorry. I thought I was protecting my family's future. I see now that I was just stealing from yours. I hope one day you can forgive me." No signature, just that. I set the letter down, feeling neither the satisfaction of vindication nor the sting of fresh pain. Instead, there was a quiet acceptance, like watching a tide retreat. You don't control the ocean, you just decide whether to stand in it or step back to dry land. That evening, I took the letter to the fire pit in my backyard. The flames caught quickly, curling the edges inward, turning Marcus's words into embers. I whispered a prayer, not for reconciliation, but for his peace wherever he could find it. Some bridges once burned are better left as ashes. Life moved forward. I started hosting Sunday teas for women from Haven House, letting them wander my garden, gather fresh herbs, sit on the porch swing. We shared stories over peach cobbler, not as victims, but as survivors who had learned that boundaries are not walls. They're doors with locks, and we decide who gets the key. One Sunday, as the sun dipped low and fireflies stitched light into the dusk, Ruth leaned over and said, "You know, Margaret, you've done more than win. You've built something they can't touch, and that's rarer than gold." I smiled, watching the last light fade over the tree line. "It's not about gold," I said. "It's about planting something that grows long after you're gone." Weeks later, I hung a new sign just inside my garden gate. It read, "This is a place of welcome for those who bring kindness, and a place of farewell for those who don't." I don't know if Marcus or Tiffany will ever see it, but I do know this. My story is no longer theirs to twist or tarnish. I own it, word for word, day by day. And in the quiet of my home, surrounded by the life I've chosen, I finally understand what my late husband once told me under a Savannah sunset. The best revenge is living well, but the truest victory is living free. I'm doing both, and I'm not giving either back.